Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second in Safer London series of webinars that we're running across summer 2020. We, because of the pandemic, decided to host webinars instead of do something that would have been a bit more of a standard launch as Safer London launches its strategy this year. I think the purpose really was not necessarily to launch the strategy, but to begin a dialogue. Those of you that attended our previous webinar would have seen that we invited colleagues from across the sector to talk about the issues facing young Londoners. And today we've done the same thing. I'm really pleased to say that we've got Anthony Scott from Aim High joining us a little bit later. So I think one of the things that we hope people will take away from these webinars is that Safer London is really keen to work in partnership across the sector. For those of you that are not familiar with Zoom, if you scroll down to the bottom, you will see that you've got an opportunity to post questions, and we will be taking questions towards the end. Last time we had enough time to answer all of the questions, but if we don't have enough time, one of the things that we will do is post answers to the questions and this recorded webinar on our website at a later date. You can also get contact details for Anthony on the website at a later date also. Safer London's new strategy really talks about 3 pieces of work, and today we're focusing on our work that works predominantly with individuals, so it's called our people strand. And one of the things that we wanted particularly to start a debate around was this notion of the victim-perpetrator divide. We find it actually not very helpful at all to be talking about young people that are victims or children that are perpetrators. Our experience is that most people sit in both camps, really. We tried as hard as possible to ensure that young people have a voice through all the work that Safer London does, and we've not been great at that, and we've got a lot more work to do. But we're kicking off all of these webinars by listening to the voice of one of our young leaders. We've got a participation, a voice group, and we've got quite a powerful video now. So I'm going to ask my colleague to press the controls and let's hear from one of our young Londoners. Thank you.
London's always been my home. And London is difficult. It is. As a young person, it's very hard living in London because there is a lot of bad influence, but there's also a lot of gang violence and a lot of killings, a lot of things like with violence and knife crime and things like that. We see it as it's coming from the younger generation and saying that we're the ones that cause these problems. I think that us as young people, our voices are kept in the dark. I don't think that we're heard. They see us as the problem, but they don't really know. Like, some people don't really know what's going on behind closed doors. Kids can get beaten up by their parents or their siblings. The only way they feel like they can escape by turning to the road. From a young age, I got involved with a lot of wrong people, and I've associated myself with the hate crowd. I got introduced to them by another person. We then started talking, then we started becoming close, and then things just went sideways. I started staying out late. From there, it just built up and built up. So I never really had no one. So that's what made me want to hang around them. I just thought that they would be like a little brotherhood to me. Like, I see them as brothers from different mothers, really. Thought that they would support me in anything or help me with anything that I needed help with. These friends made me feel like I was nothing. Like, I was scared about themselves and didn't want to. As soon as something happened to me or someone else, they didn't really care. They did it for themselves. So at that moment, it was like, it just made me feel like I was nothing. I was something at the bottom of their shoe. I didn't really with my auntie. So it was kind of hard for me to talk about certain situations because I felt like I can't really talk to her because she wouldn't understand what's going on and how much it is affecting me and what I'm really going through. There was one situation that I told her about. So like I got attacked and I told her what it was for. I told her that you can't go to certain professionals for a certain reason. It just felt like she didn't really care of what side I was coming from. In a way, we don't trust professionals because of, I believe it's because the way that some of them carry themselves, and we lose trust in them. Like if, say for instance, they let you down and you feel like, oh, I can't go back to them again and ask them, could they help me? Because they've already let me down once. What makes you think they're not going to let me down again? With certain professionals like that you've worked with for a long time, and then you get a sudden change of another person that you're working with, and that I understand that some of them, they may have your case files or whatever, but they weren't there to understand where you was coming from more than the other worker that you was working with. So they will judge you even more because they're not understanding. If I tried to go to like professionals and I try ask them for help, they would think that it's a joke or I'm just saying this to get myself out of this situation. They feel like I shouldn't be in this predicament or this situation. They thought that I should have been on a right path. It just made me feel like I don't really want to interact with them unless it's necessary. If it's not necessary, then I don't really want to be interacting with you for you to judge me even more and not understand I've done the thing that I've done because of certain situations. Relationship between the worker and the client is very important. So I don't turn to professionals to try and help me unless I know that it's going to go a long way. It helped me to get back on the right track. I know that certain things I can do on my own. I know that I may need that little push or that little nudge, but I know I can do it on my own. They've given me the encouragement, gave me a lot of insight on what I could do to help myself. So it's helped me change my mindset and helped me really to become a better person. Made me feel like I'm myself now.
Thank you. Sorry, the sound quality wasn't great, and I think me not muted didn't help. But could I ask everybody to mute? I think that may help. What's useful for me to say is that video will be available on our website afterwards, and it definitely is worth listening to. I've listened to it a number of times now, and I think it illuminates the point that we want to discuss today very, very well. And I'd like to thank the young man that took the trouble to make it for us. Now I'm going to hand you over to one of our senior leaders in the organisation, Alison Campbell, who is our organisational lead for young people affected by violence and exploitation. And Alison will pretty much take you through the rest of this webinar so I can sit back and relax and enjoy it like the rest of you. So I hope you're all going to find the next 45, 50 minutes useful. Thank you, Alison.
Hi and welcome everyone. My name's Alison Campbell. I work for Safer London as the organisational lead for violence and exploitation. I oversee the people strand of our work, focusing on our one-to-one support for young Londoners and their families. In today's webinar, we're going to look at the victim-perpetrator divide. And in my experience, I work with both perpetrators as well as victims. And what I've come to learn, this is a grey area between both perspectives. And to be quite honest, it's not my position to pass judgment or project my personal viewpoints on individuals that we work with. So today you're going to hear from some of our practitioners in our team that work directly with young Londoners. And they're going to talk to you about their experiences from a unique perspective. But first, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about our one-to-one work that we do with young Londoners and their families. And this is about how we're uniting our skills and services to better help and make London a safer city for everyone who lives there. As an organisation, we have a good track record of safeguarding children and young people and their families, and the Safer London services have continued to evolve over time. Now, historically, the support we delivered was aimed at young people that experienced violence and exploitation. And through this, there were two separate services, LGE, formerly known as London Gang Exit, which provided support to young Londoners and their families who were affected by violence in the community, and Empower, which worked with young people who had experienced or were at risk of criminal sexual exploitation. This is what we've learned, and this is how we intend to move forward. We aim to bring these two services and practitioners together to develop a more collaborative way of working to safeguard and protect young Londoners and their families, and how we do this in partnership with existing stakeholders and potentially new partnerships. And we also believe that there are some elements of our one-to-one work that should always be present, no matter what the young person's presenting with. And I'm going to give you an example. I mean, I've been in this field for over 25 years, and it's really, really important that we, treat young people and their families with the utmost respect, placing them at the centre of our work, helping them come up with a plan on what they want to see happen, and most importantly, how they aim to achieve it and how we can make a long-lasting, sustainable difference to their lives. The Safer London are in the process of developing our one-to-one service model frameworks. And as we know, young people and their families present with a range of complex needs. And as an organisation, we need to continue to respond to those needs, which also requires evidence-based practice, as this is an integral part of our service delivery. I just want to share with you some examples of our service models that are in the current, developmental stages. And it talks about relationship-based, person-centred approaches, strengths-based approaches, trauma-informed, ensuring that we really listen to the young person without re-traumatising them, contextual safeguarding, tier 1 element of that, and you're going to hear more about that in our next webinars. Identity-informed, and this really underpins the theory of intersectionality, because we are really working as an organisation about embedding cultural competency and anti-oppressiveness and working towards helping young people understand the cycle of oppression. And advocacy, amplifying the young Londoner's voice and helping them navigate through various systems. And collaboration is key. Safer London cannot work in silo. We need to continue working with stakeholders to ensure that we aim to achieve the best possible outcomes with young Londoners and their families. By doing this, we need to make sure that we don't duplicate what we're doing. We need to continue promoting young people, families, and the community voice, having a non-judgmental approach. As many young people have spoken to me and said to me that they always feel as though they're being judged in society. Persistence is really important, despite sometimes young people tend to, don't really engage at times, but it's really, we need to maintain a consistent approach to allow us to build relationships. Promoting appropriate language, working with young people, using the appropriate language which they can understand. Of course, we do this by maintaining professional boundaries, but it's about talking with them rather than talking at them or talking about them. And participation is key, having a real meaningful influence on all services that we deliver. gathering and responding appropriate feedback and responding as and when we can. And there's a specialist element of that work that we do, looking at exploitation, violence, gender-based violence, sexual abuse, additional needs, working with families, mental health and well-being, housing advocacy, relocation and support, peer-based interventions, place-based interventions, bystander mental violence preventions, and also community engagement and education. So that was just a summary of the service models that we're currently developing. Now we're going to move on to today's topic, and we're going to look at some services try to support victims, others work with perpetrators. But what if the person you're working with is both? Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce a colleague of mine who I've worked with over the years, and his name's Anthony Scott, and he's from an organisation called Aim High. And he's going to speak to you and deliver a presentation about the hidden unspoken truth, the trauma that runs within, and the thread that is woven into both victims and perpetrators. Over to you, Anthony. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. During the presentation, I'm going to be asking Helen to move my slides along because I didn't want to get caught in the technical aspects of trying to share the technology. So as Alison said, my name is Anthony Scott, but everybody calls me Scott. And I work for an organisation which is my own called Aim High, and that stands for Aspirations, Inspiration and Motivation. And we are a community interest group, and we are based in one of the London boroughs. And we have been working with victims and perpetrators of serious youth violence for quite a number of years. But also a large part of our project is that we provide training to external services, namely local authorities, and recently delivered some training around disproportionality in the criminal justice system and what that actually means. Helen, could we go to the next slide, please? So today I'm going to be talking about the hidden unspoken truth, the trauma that runs within, and the thread that is woven into both victims and perpetrators. And as Alison really eloquently kind of put it, it's a really thin line to distinguish against the both of those two people, the victim and the perpetrator. Where do we draw the line? What is it that makes these two entities almost one? What is the thread that is woven into victims and perpetrators? Helen, can we go to the next one, please? So this is a picture that I found, and I use this for lots of different training when I'm working with professionals, when I'm working with young people, to try and get them to understand that this hyper arousal state that young people are in, and what it actually means, how it impacts them, and how it makes them function in the world today. So we've got hyperarousal, where young people are really anxious and worried and concerned and almost in that flight or flight stage. And then we've got hyperarousal, where young people are just withdrawn, where they're just not really in tune or almost like numb to the environment. And the work that we try and do is to get people to focus on what we call that middle ground, the window of tolerance, where they're almost in a place where they can start thinking and tapping into that emotive side of their brain, where they can actually start understanding their own emotional well-being, their own feelings, to understand, am I a victim, am I a perpetrator? And something that I talk a lot about is trauma and intergenerational trauma. Helen, can we go to the next one, please? Thank you. So I'm not gonna say to professionals who already might know about trauma and what it actually means, but I find this saying really powerful. This was taught to me years ago by grandfather. In the Caribbean, we have a saying, what is a joke to you is detrimental to me. And when I think about that saying, when I think about what does that actually mean, it's pertaining to trauma. We cannot dismiss what a young person perceives as trauma and what they don't. What a perpetrator perceives as trauma, what a victim does. So trauma is individual and it's personal. And the worst type of trauma to go through is that personal trauma where you have been harmed or you have been subjected to violence. We cannot and we should not dismiss how young people have been impacted by the occurrence of serious youth violence in today's society. And when I think about that, I think about all the means of transmission. So we have social media, we have community trauma, we have intergenerational trauma, where young people, victims, perpetrators might come from a certain area and they've almost been told a narrative about traumatic events that were before their time. And unbeknown to them, they get caught up in that intergenerational trauma. For me, working with young people now, working with victims of violence, I know this is really a sweeping statement, but we have a generation of young people who are literally living in a hyper aroused state day in and day of their life. This is their normal functioning. This is how they are navigating the world. Can we go to the next slide, please, Ellen? So when I think about the unspoken truth, what I am pertaining to is what we call adverse childhood experiences. And there's lots of training, there's lots of information available on the internet through your contacts where you can have discussions about adverse childhood experiences. And when I think about those, we have experiences in the community, i.e. physical and emotional neglect, mental illness, incarceration, domestic violence, mental depression. But then if I think what's underneath the surface of that, we have adverse community experiences where we're looking at things as poverty, violence, lack of opportunities, community disruption, and poor housing and areas of high socio-economic deprivation. All of these things are things that are traumatic for our young people. So we're coupling those with the occurrence of violence that young people are exposed to. And that's why when I think about perpetrators and victims, there is a thin line. So in my previous role, I worked in a major trauma centre, one of the 4 trauma centres in London. And for 2 years, I met a number of victims of serious youth violence. And when I met with family and friends, because of the relationships that I had built with them, they almost told me that they had been the perpetrators as well. And it was a cycle that they got into where they didn't want to be the prey. They didn't want to be the victim. So they then in turn became the perpetrators. And those are the people who have been traumatized by violence, where they had now taken it to a next level where I don't want to be the victim no more. So I'm going to be the perpetrator. And it is that trauma that they experience that affects their almost empathy, their thinking, their emotional well-being, that can drive them to be victim perpetrator. Helen, can we have the next one, please? So working with that cohort, some people think, how do you break the cycle? How do you stop people who have been traumatized by adverse childhood experiences, by community violence, by intergenerational stories? And it's about recovery and resilience. So I was listening to Alison speak and she was talking around the relationship and how that is a fundamental part of the work. So when I think about that resilience, not everyone that experiences a potential traumatic situation will become traumatized by it. It is dependent on a number of protective factors that an individual has to enable them to cope. Community resilience is an important factor. So when I think about community resilience, I'm thinking about organisations like Safer London, who do that direct work, who provide that connection and that space for young people who have been victims, who have been perpetrators, to almost understand the cycle. And something that Alison mentioned, which I thought was really fundamental in terms of the work that we do and how we try and help those two different people, is about relationships. Helen, could we go to the next slide? So relationships is the key. The relationships that we build with young people is the key to help addressing the victim-perpetrator cycle. Research has indicated that the quality of the relationship between a client and a worker is the highest predictor of effectiveness, no matter what approach. So I'm a therapeutic counsellor, so I studied in psychodynamic, person-centered, Jung. It doesn't matter what theory I have in my toolkit. It's the relationship that I build with victims and perpetrator that almost enables change, that almost enables that way of thinking around where do I fit in that cycle. So Safer London, I really commend the work that they're doing, because I see how they have that at the core of their interventions around building sustainable relationships with both victims and perpetrators, because we cannot distinguish between the two. And I just wanted to acknowledge that the relationship is key. And from my experience, is how we build that. So Alison talked about being integrity, being open, being transparent, being aware of the cultural diversities of your group. And that's what I wanted to think about. And that's what I wanted the participants who's in the call today to think about, the trauma that is the unwoven thread that ties both victims and perpetrator together. And we have to work in a non-judgmental, open, honest way and understand that that is the thread that makes them actually two of the same people. So I am going to be here for the rest of the webinar. I think at the end there is a Q&A section. So if there's any questions or any thoughts, please put them in the participation thing. I don't know what it's called. Sorry, I'm not that technical. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening to me today, and I hope it's given you some food for thought around this unwoven thread that ties them both together. Thank you.
Thank you, Scotty. What an amazing presentation. Thank you. Wow, it's really, really powerful. Okay, so now what we're going to do, we've got two Safer London staff here with us who are going to talk to you about working with victims and perpetrators. So can you just introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Karen Bowie. I'm the Peer Service Manager at Safer London.
Afternoon, guys. I'm Davis Williams. I'm a support worker.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask you some questions. So first of all, Karen, can you give me some examples of the kind of things that young people you work with are victims of?
Okay, so some of the young Londoners that we work with are victims of child sexual exploitation. And that involves grooming via things like affection, buying them gifts, giving them free drugs and giving them money. So it's usually something that young people either want or they're lacking in their lives. They are then exploited and coerced into engaging in sexual acts. And this is often a hard scenario to escape for a young person, because the situation kind of leads to, or can lead to, threat, violence, humiliation, and also by the exploiter telling them that they're special or they're loved. So it's really hard to sometimes break away when you're not getting that in other areas of your life. We also see child criminal exploitation. And similar to CSC, young Londoners are groomed with promises of money, status and friendship and free drugs. And then they're trafficked, exploited or coerced into committing crimes, such as running drugs in county line scenarios. Often they feel trapped into these situations and feel unable to break away from it because they've been moved out of area, they're isolated from their families and peers, and they're being punished for non-compliance through violence or sexual assault. And sometimes the threats can be made to their life or to their family's life, so they feel they have to protect either themselves or their families by not kind of upsetting their perpetrator. The young Londoners we work with are also victims of violence, and this comes in a number of forms, such as gang-related violence and being exposed to it within the family home. So that could be domestic violence, or if they're in an intimate relationship and they're experiencing domestic violence within that. Some of the factors, such as being underage, of consent and under the influence of substances, can also affect the scenario in terms of sexual abuse. So being underage and also being under the influence of substances can make it difficult for them to acknowledge or recognise it, and to understand that they're not to blame, regardless of whether they've engaged with their perpetrator repeatedly.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Davis, I'm just going to ask you some questions. So what about young people who are involved in committing crimes and who are labelled as perpetrators? What kinds of crimes are they involved in your experience?
Yeah, it varies massively, Sometimes it could be small things. Well, they see it small as like possession of cannabis, stealing mobile phones, or mopeds and stuff of that nature. And sometimes it can get a bit more violent, it could be stuff around like carrying machetes, like 12 inches long, like crazy stuff, like to murder, So it really ranges. And sometimes when you listen to the young Londoners' story and them like reliving it, you can kind of see like the points where it happened, and okay, like that was the moment which certain things occurred. But even though a lot of these young Londoners, who are amazing, by the way, have got some sad stories, what we do have to do is something that I really advocate. We have to separate the experiences, like what's happened and who they are as a person, and that moment of madness that they've seen, So something that we definitely have to create that divide.
Okay. Thank you, Davis. So just out of interest, so the idea that young people can be both victim and perpetrator, can you kind of give me some examples about that, please?
Yeah, and I really love that question, and I really love the way Safer London pushes that narrative, because it's something that I really support. So I can think of straight away one young Londoner that I've worked with. We'll call his name Kwame for now. It's not his real name, Okay. And apologies if anyone's got a child here called Kwame. It's not your son, I promise, yeah? So Kwame is 16, and he's from a notorious London estate. I'm not going to say where it is because I don't want to offend no one. He's got 2 older brothers, and his brothers are notorious to the area where they live. And they're notorious for the wrong reasons, drug trafficking, violence, and so they've got a name. And at a young age, so Kwame is the youngest out of his 2 brothers. And at a young age, not only did his 2 older brothers say, no, Kwame, you're not going to be doing what we're doing, you're going to choose a different path. And the parents also were really supportive of that narrative as well. So Kwame, from a young age, was very resistant. He had a lot of resilience about him, and he had strong values. Mum got him involved in playing basketball, football, lots of after-school activities, until one day. And I remember when he was telling me this story, you could see his face, his whole mood dropped. So I can see it was something that Mr. Scott was talking about in terms of a traumatic experience. Coming back from football, it was late. He's in this area that he's comfortable in. So, he didn't feel like, okay, I need to be alert. He was just casual, listening to his headphones. And basically he got rushed. Later on, he found out it's because something that his brothers did. And they realized that, oh, you're so-and-so younger brother. So they beat him up viciously. He got stabbed. And the worst thing that he said, when he was sharing the story, the thing that really, really it really shook him up was the fact that he was screaming for help, screaming his life was at risk. He was crying. He saw neighbors close their curtains, Yeah, so yeah, they're closing the curtains, and also yeah, no one just came to help him, so he had to drag himself home. And it was at that point where he says he doesn't feel safe in London. He doesn't feel that London has his back, and he had to go somewhere where they did have his back, and that was obviously his brother's affiliation. Everyone on the estate was up to something, and it was at that point where that night he rolled out, which means, for those that don't know, got into the car with his brothers and a few friends. They had weapons, and he went looking for these individuals. And that's where, again, he started to prove himself, and he started to get involved in all sorts of violence, because now he adopted the values of their collective, which were the mandem, or some people call him the gang. He will call it his family. So yeah, and it was a space of like 7 days. 7 days from, he went from being a victim, he got beat up, to, you know, his whole life, his whole being just transformed.
Okay. So I guess my thing is this: you can see where the both of it's kind of interlinked in what you've just described.
And sometimes it's at a drop of a coin. You know, it's just like one incident, and yeah, you know, all these factors. It's like making a cake. You've got all these different ingredients, and then boom, you've got a nice, you know, vegan carrot cake. You know, so yeah, all of these things do play a part in who he is today. But what I must say as well, like, his journey is not finished. You know, like, he's still got a lot of work to do. He's still optimistic, and it's about getting him to trust London again, trust the process, and he doesn't need to continue the path that he's on, and that's the challenging bit.
Thank you, Davis.
It's okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask Karen a question. Karen, you and your team work directly with young Londoners. How often in your work do you come across young Londoners who could be classified as both victim and perpetrator? And from your experience, how often does that happen? Is it often, or is it, you know, tell us a bit about that.
I would say that it's fairly often. So many of the young Londoners that we work with have vulnerabilities such as economical or emotional, and they found themselves being easily led into situations where they can be coerced, controlled and drawn into harmful lifestyles. And obviously, once that happens, it's quite easy to become entrenched in that and very difficult to get out of it. Being a victim can lead to becoming a perpetrator and vice versa. And there are often common themes that run throughout of both of those sort of dynamics. And just one example, sort of off the top of my head really, is that if someone's experienced addiction issues and they're in a chaotic and abusive relationship, they could end up being involved in criminal activities such as drug dealing, theft or sex work in order to fund their addiction. And often, or sometimes, that could be also being sent out to fund their partner's addiction as well. So although they're perpetrating by committing crimes, they're also a victim of domestic violence and a controlling relationship. I think a lack of the right support can lead to young Londoners ending up committing criminal acts because it seems to them like there's no other choice for them. There's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to ask for help, and they don't know how to ask for help often. And it's really important to remember that the information that is provided on a referral to us only gives us part of the picture for the young person. It doesn't always give a true reflection of the young Londoner's circumstances or their needs. And this is why obviously completing assessments is so essential in building that relationship and really truly getting to know that young person and being able to identify what the potential is for them and where they want their life to go.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Davis, in your experience, what kind of approaches do you think are needed for young Londoners who are both victims and perpetrators?
So yeah, you've got some good questions there.
I'm keeping you on your toes today, Davis.
Yes. One of the main things for me is about building genuine long-term relationships, you know. I remember, and I'll give you like two examples, you know, like I've been there when I've seen a young person for the first time, a young Londoner, and a probation officer comes into the picture, and I can see the power dynamic straight away where, I'm sorry for anyone that's a probation officer, we're not talking about you, but there are some out there, and again, that they were I'm the probation officer, you listen to what I have to say, and you can see the young person they get so deflated. You can physically see it. It's sad. one thing that I just stand for is every time I meet a young person, you know, I'm just very polite. I'm on their level, you know. I don't exert my personality on them. I create strong boundaries with them as well, but also I let them know that this is a partnership. We're journeying together, and yeah, this is the destination and this is where we're starting from. So yeah, asking good questions, being open, being transparent, being friendly. I think that compassion is very important. Like, you just have to care. Like, listen to them, listen to the experience, and really care about their experiences. I personally think that those things are the fundamentals at creating relationships with anyone, not just with young Londoners, you know, because these young Londoners we're talking about, they're our children, our nephews, and so on. And so it could be anyone. You have to be respectful. You have to speak to them on their level, and don't be afraid to share as well. Because one thing that I've realized is sometimes the young Londoners, they will say things that will challenge you as a person. What do? Do you shut them down? Do you minimize what they're saying? Or do you really take it on and say, oh, that's a good point? Do you know what I mean? So yeah. And alongside that, creating that foundation of friendship, a professional friendship, I should say, you know, it is about having an action plan, having a plan of action, so they know what that person is in this relationship for, and I'm very clear as well.
Okay. And also I think it's important about obviously sort of managing their expectations in terms of you know, initial phases. And for me, I always think about, how would I feel if I needed support, and what would I want from a service? So I kind of put myself in that position.
Yes,
you know?
absolutely. And
also, Davis, I'm sorry to cut you.
No, it's all right. Go on. It's cool.
Just tell us about what you've learned in terms of the best type of approaches for our young Londoners.
Yeah, I've learned two things. Number one, I've learned that sometimes for you to go forward, you need to go back. So sometimes with the young Londoners, you know, they want certain things from their future, but they're not prepared to go back and resolve what needs to be resolved. You know, it could be a way of it could be their perception of the universe, you know. So I've learned to, go back and to help them process some of the things that Anthony Scott was talking about. Like, they've been through trauma, you know. You can't just bury it and move forward. No, they need support. They need work. They need professionals engaging with them. So that's the first thing that I've learned. And also it's the whole being able to empower young people. You know, so many people have let them down, our young Londoners, and I feel it for them sometimes, you know. So is this about not only managing their expectations, but managing my own expectations, not saying certain things that I can't deliver, and being a part of a strong network. So if there's something that I can't do, I'm not going to say to a young Londoner, okay, I can't do it, sorry, next. I will find someone who can do it. So it's about having an extensive pool of individuals, you know, like the team in Safer London, you know, like great individuals that we can call upon to assist the young Londoner in need.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Davis. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
And just on a final note, Karen, thinking about the issue of young Londoners who are both victims of perpetrators, if there are 3 key points today that we would like the people who are taking part in this webinar to leave with, tell me what those points would be.
I think firstly, although young Londoners may be viewed as perpetrators, they are still young Londoners in need, and they deserve the opportunity to change their lives just like anybody else. The second point I would say would be anyone working with young people need to be aware of and be able to challenge their own assumptions, beliefs and bias in order to do the best work they possibly can in order to get the most positive outcomes for the young people that they're working with. And thirdly, we have to find ways of reminding ourselves of the potential for all young people in the face of our day-to-day work, which can be so difficult at times. There's no denying that, but there is hope, and young Londoners need to see and hear that belief in them in order to build their own self-belief. So, you know, we need to keep reminding ourselves that we do see positive changes, and we do get success stories out of the work that we do, and it's really important to keep reminding that on a very regular basis.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you. So now I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Richard, who's going to be available to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison. My job today is just to keep an eye on the questions that have been coming in. We've had a couple of great questions, actually, which is great to see. People are really grasping the issue that we wanted to spend a bit of time on today. So the first of those questions, which I might put to Sherry first of all, and then perhaps come to Anthony, is we've had a question about just kind of asking for to be pointed in the direction of the research into relationships and the different quality of interventions. What's out there, and where might people go and look to find out a little bit about the role that relationships plays in this work, and also the different qualities of interventions. If we can come to you first on that one, please, Sherry.
Yeah, hi. It's interesting. I wonder if the person that asked that question wasn't at our previous webinar, because to a certain extent that is some of the focus of our work, that at Safer London, you know, there's a lot of debate around reachable, teachable moments against credible, trusted relationships. And at Safer London, I think, you know, we're certain that you need both, to be honest with you. There's so much research out there that talks about the quality of a relationship between a worker and a young person being absolutely critical. I think recently the Children's Commissioner published something about it, but there's stuff almost regularly coming out from the British Social Work Association, numerous academics. There's also as well quite a lot of work that happens, for example, if you look at the work of Cure Violence out in America, and they talk about those credible relationships being absolutely critical to engage with young people. So whoever asked that question, I would recommend they listen to the previous webinar, and I'm going to see if Anthony wants to add anything to what I've just said, really.
Sorry, I was just looking on my material to see if I could find any specific pieces of research. There is some that I found before. If that person who's got that question wants to leave an email, we can point them in some directions. But as a counsellor, when I was training, one of the things that was fundamental that kind of was embedded in us is that the relationship is the therapy. Doesn't matter what school of thought you come from, whether you're psychodynamic, person-centered, the relationship that you build with your clients is what affects effective change. Because what that relationship does, it builds this thing that we call epistemic trust, where that person is now open to learn from you. Because in that relationship, it builds that sense of trust and well-being and someone valuing you as a person. And that's when you're more likely to be open to learn from that person. So as you were saying, there's so much evidence out there, there's so much material in regards to social care, in regards to the therapeutic alliance. Is it that teachable, reachable moment, or is it actually the relationship that drives the change? So if you want to leave an email address, I'm sure that we could find some research or some material that we could point you in the direction of. But just from a perspective of working with this cohort for such a long time, the relationship is the therapy.
And I'm going to pick up on that and be really, really embarrassed. I'm currently co-chairing a group with Professor Peter Fonagy, who I believe is one of the leading researchers around the subject that you've just spoken about, Anthony. So certainly looking at the Anna Freud Centre and the work of Peter Fonagy would be as good a starting point as anywhere if people want academic papers around that. And as I say, anything that we find we'll stick on our website. Conscious of the time, Richard, we could witter about this, but I can see there are other questions. Is there any others that you'd like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just pop this one straight over to you first of all, Sherry. We've got a really interesting question about the benefits of a restorative approach for both perpetrators and victims. Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a lot of thoughts about it, and I'm really sad that we're currently probably in a climate where restorative work isn't as valued as it should be. I've had a real lot of experience recently and the privilege of working with some of the judiciary, including Baroness Howe, and had the opportunity to discuss some of this with her. And I think there really are enormous benefits. If we look at what the drivers of violence are, which we know is around inequality, social injustice, and again, Professor Fonagy will talk very much around anxiety. What we need to do is understand that actually very often the criminal justice system doesn't have the answers. I think if people want to get their head around the concept of the benefits of a restorative justice approach, they would be probably hard pushed to find a better place to look than the Common Justice website out in the States. Michelle Sered also wrote a book about the restorative justice work they are doing in primarily New York. And we're trying to do some hookup with the guys that deliver that work in New York. It would be great if there's enough interest. We maybe could perhaps see if we can run a webinar around it. But the benefits are extreme. I mean, I think we really have to question ourselves whether or not young people going through the criminal justice system, both as victims and perpetrators, do we really think that justice is served at the end of it? And actually those of us that have worked with young people that go round and round and round realise that actually justice is very often not served for any of us.
Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, we've had another really interesting question as well. I'm going to direct this one first of all to Alison and then perhaps our practice staff. We've talked a lot on this webinar about the importance of building a relationship. But if we do build good relationships with young Londoners, Davis, you were very clear about some of the challenges that can arise. What can happen if, despite that good relationship, that young Londoner presents very challenging behaviour or does become involved in further offending? What do we do when we see these kinds of real challenges and things aren't just moving forward in a nice kind of smooth fashion? Alison.
In my experience, you know, working with young people, you know, young Londoners, things are always going to go up and down. There's always going to be things along the way, and there's going to be a lot of challenges. And, you know, in my experience, I've worked with young people who, you know, today it's one thing, tomorrow it's something else. So it's really important to have that supportive, consistent approach, making sure that we're working in partnership with all other services to kind of share information as and when it's needed, and to continue to guide that young person on a journey. And sometimes it's about advocating for young people, you know, finding out what's really going on for them. And, you know, people just don't behave a certain way for no reason, and we have to really dig deep and find out what is going on. And I think working for Safer London, you know, I'm really, really passionate about young Londoners, and, you know, I've worked with many, many different young Londoners over the years and faced numerous challenges. And actually, we have some young people that have come through services. We've gone back 6 months later to check in with them, to see how they are, to see what's going on. And, you know, and it's been some positive, you know, endings and some less positive endings. But, you know, I just think it's about really believing in that young person, supporting them with their families, liaising professionally, and just keep going and identifying what the problem is, and continue to challenge other organisations to make sure that we can work together to provide the best care.
It's a really honest answer. Thank you, Alison. We're getting very close to our own time, but Davis, I just wanted to come to you because I've heard you talk about this a lot. How is it for you as, you know, one of our guys who's, you know, in the room with young people on a regular basis? You put that work in, you really try to build a good relationship, and then stuff happens, either behaviour-wise, which is very challenging, or, you know, there's further offending. How is that for you as one of our support workers?
Yeah, for me, it's a part of life, you know. Life happens. You can either take control of your life, or life is going to force you to move in a certain direction. One thing that I always say to all of the young Londoners that I engage with is, it's not about the end destination, it's about the journey. You know, we have to journey with them. And whilst on that journey, are you extracting all the lessons that they're going to take for your own development? And literally, that's the most important thing. Because you have to be present. You know, like a lot of the young Londoners, and I'm going to try and keep it short, they're focusing on like years and years down the road. But sometimes you have to focus on right now, like what's happening right now, what can you learn? And then when you wake up tomorrow, what are you going to learn tomorrow? And then so on and so forth. And when something does happen, they need to be willing to, learn from it as well, so they can better themselves. So yeah, it's just about the journey for me, and these things are going to happen. But when it does happen, what do you do? Sometimes when life throws lemons at you, what do you make? Lemonade.
Thank you, Davis. Okay, we're yeah, as I said, we're really getting close on time now. So I'd like to hand you back to our Chief Executive, Sherry, who will just close off proceedings for us today.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, I'm hoping everybody enjoyed that as much as I did. It's amazing how we've all moved to these new ways of working, and you know, it's also amazing what passes for entertainment now. So I'm hoping that many of you ate your lunch, enjoyed what was being said. I can see there are loads of questions coming in, so we'll try to answer them and put some answers up on our webinar. I'd like to thank Davis and Karen and Alison and Richard for all of their input. In particular, I'd like to thank Anthony for joining us here. As I say, it just really reiterates that idea that at Safer London we're interested in partnerships. So if there's anybody out there that's keen to work with us, please get in contact. We really know that this is an issue that nobody should be working in silos, that we all need to be working together. I'd also as well urge all of you to sign up for future webinars. I don't know if many of you had the time last night to watch Panorama and its reflections on the positive outcomes of the Scottish Violence Reduction Unit. I've had the real honour of going up and spending time with Niven and some of his colleagues up there. And I think actually even watching that panorama last night will respond to many of the questions that have come up today about positive relationships, restorative justice, just, you know, being tenacious and a supportive worker alongside people that demonstrates that change can happen. There's a great piece of video on there, a colleague up in Scotland who was an armed robber and a heroin addict is now doing some amazing work to support young people and demonstrates that change can happen even sometimes years and years later. We're going to be joined by one of the Scottish VRU or somebody that was connected to the Scottish VRU on the next webinar, a chap called Graham Golden. That focus is going to be about peers and the strength of peers. And then our last webinar is going to be around places. I think Safer London is probably one of the only organisations in London that will take a safeguarding referral around a place rather than a person. So if you're interested in that, please also join us. So once again, thank you all for taking the time. And please tweet about it. I should have said this at the beginning. Hashtag Safer London Violence Perpetrator or Victim Perpetrator is the hashtag. I'm still learning all this stuff. I come from a flip chart era. So once again, thank you for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Bye.